I never believed in Bigfoot until the summer of 1983 when I met one that spoke to me in perfect English on a hiking trail in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina. And what happened when that creature realized I was recording our conversation changed my entire life, forcing me to make a choice between proof and survival. Let me tell you this story from the beginning, because even now, at 75 years old, I still wake up some nights hearing that voice in the darkness. The morning I found the handprint, I had been in the mountains for 11 days without seeing another human being, and I had started to believe that was exactly how I wanted to spend the rest of my life. My name is Daniel Cross, and in the autumn of 1983, I was 30 years old, working as a freelance wildlife photographer out of Asheville, North Carolina. I had come to the Appalachians the way most people come to places that eventually change them, without fully understanding why. The assignment was straightforward enough. A small conservation magazine called Wild South had contracted me to document the recovery of black bear populations in the southern highlands following the logging restrictions of the late 70s. 2 weeks in the backcountry, they said. Get us something nobody has seen before. I had been happy to oblige. I was always happy when the assignment pointed away from people and toward trees. My base camp was a canvas tent pitched on a flat shelf of rock above a creek called Hazel Branch, in a stretch of the Pisgah National Forest that saw almost no recreational traffic. I had chosen the location deliberately. The forest there was old growth in the valleys and dense second growth on the ridges, the kind of layered wilderness that takes generations to accumulate. In the mornings, fog pooled in the creek bottoms so thickly you could lose sight of your own boots. By midday, the light came through the canopy in long, angled shafts that turned the air itself into something you could almost touch. I had photographed forests across the American West, in Alaska, in the Smokies, but nothing had ever felt quite as enclosed and watchful as Pisgah in October. I kept a routine because routine keeps you sane when you are alone for long stretches. Wake before dawn, brew coffee on the small propane stove, check my cameras, a pair of Nikon F3 bodies, and a selection of lenses I kept in a padded case that I treated with more care than I treated myself. Load fresh film. Eat something from my food supply, usually oatmeal or crackers with peanut butter. Then hike to whatever position I had scouted the previous evening and wait. The waiting was the part people outside my profession never understood. They imagined wildlife photography as perpetual action, as running toward animals and snapping frantically. In reality, it was mostly stillness, hours of it, sitting against a tree trunk until the bark pattern pressed itself into your jacket, and you became, in some small way, part of the forest rather than an intruder inside it. On the 11th morning, I was positioned above a blackberry thicket near the creek, hoping to catch the large female bear I had been tracking for 4 days. The light was perfect, low and golden, coming from the east and filtering through a stand of tulip poplars that were just beginning to turn. I had my 400mm lens mounted, the camera resting on a beanbag across a fallen log. My thermos was warm against my thigh. The forest was making all its usual sounds: jays, a distant woodpecker, water moving over stones. That was when I noticed the log. It was a large red oak that had fallen sometime in the previous year, lying parallel to the creek about 20 yards downstream from my position. I had passed it every morning for 4 days and registered it without interest. But that morning, something was different. The moss on the upper side of the log had been disturbed in a long strip, as if something had sat on it and shifted its weight back and forth. The disturbance was fresh. You could see where the moisture in the moss had been pressed out, and the surface had dried slightly darker at the edges of the impression. Beside the log, in a small patch of creek mud that had been pushed up by the previous night's rain, there was a handprint. I noticed it only because the bear I was tracking had left a print in similar mud 2 mornings earlier, and my eye had learned to look for that particular shape. But this was not a bear print. It had 5 distinct digits arranged in a pattern that was recognizably like a human hand, but wider across the palm than any hand I had ever seen, and the fingers were longer, heavier, pressing deeper into the mud than you would expect from something of roughly human weight. The thumb was set lower and further back than a human thumb would be. The whole impression was perhaps 14 inches from the base of the palm to the tip of the longest finger. I stared at it for a long time without moving. Then I picked up my camera and walked down to the log, slowly, the way you move when you are trying not to disturb something you do not yet understand. I crouched beside the print and photographed it with my 50mm lens, placing my own hand beside it for scale. My hand looked like something belonging to a child. I stood up and looked at the surrounding forest. The trees stood close together in every direction, their trunks gray and dark in the early light. The fog was still moving through the lower branches. Nothing moved that I could see. I told myself it was a bear. Unusual, perhaps. Possibly a deformity in the foot that had produced a strange impression. I was good at telling myself reasonable things. I packed up my gear and hiked back to camp. I made a second cup of coffee and sat looking at the photographs I had taken on my small field reference print, the Polaroid I carried for quick documentation before I processed my main film. The print on the Polaroid looked exactly like what it had looked like in the mud. A hand. A very large hand, belonging to something that walked on 2 feet and sat on fallen logs in the hours before dawn, and was gone before morning. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the creek and the wind, and thought about the print for a long time before I slept. When I finally closed my eyes, I realized I had been so focused on the handprint that I had forgotten to check whether the camera bag I always left outside the tent had been moved. In the morning, I found it sitting exactly as I had left it, every buckle fastened, every zipper closed. But pressed into the soft earth beneath it was a second handprint, pointing directly toward the tent door. Whatever had made it had been standing close enough to touch the canvas while I slept. I did not go looking for it. I want to be clear about that. What happened 3 days after I found the second print was not the result of any plan on my part. I was simply in the forest doing my work when the forest offered me something I had not asked for and did not know how to refuse. The day had turned cold by noon, a sharp northern change that dropped the temperature 15 degrees inside 2 hours and brought a light rain that moved through the trees in horizontal sheets. I was sheltering under a rock overhang about 2 miles northeast of camp, my cameras wrapped in plastic bags inside my pack, eating crackers and watching a pair of ravens work a deer carcass on the slope below me. The rain made a sound on the leaves like distant applause, constant and directionless. I heard it before I saw it. A sound that was not the rain and not the ravens and not the creek I could hear somewhere in the fog below. It was a low exhalation, measured and deliberate, coming from the tree line to my left at a distance of perhaps 30 feet. The kind of sound a very large animal makes when it has been moving for a long time and stops to assess something. I turned my head slowly. I did not reach for my camera. At the edge of the overhang's shadow, where the rain was still falling and the light was gray and flat, something was standing in the trees and looking at me. It was tall, easily 7 feet, possibly more, and it stood in a posture that was neither fully erect nor stooped, but something in between. A posture that looked considered rather than instinctive, as though it had decided that particular stance was the correct one for this particular moment. Its body was covered in dark hair, longer and heavier than any animal I knew, matted in places with rain and what looked like lichen. The shoulders were extraordinarily wide. The arms were long, ending in hands that I recognized even from 30 feet as the hands that had made the prints in the mud. The face was what stopped me from standing up and running. It was watching me with an expression I can only describe as patient. Not the blank watchfulness of a deer or the wary hostility of a bear. Something more deliberate. The brow was heavy and the forehead broad, the jaw powerful, but the eyes were set wide apart and were dark and lit with something that had nothing to do with instinct. It was considering me. I could feel that it was considering me the way you feel when someone across a room is thinking carefully about what they are going to say to you before they say it. We stayed like that for perhaps 2 minutes. Rain falling, ravens working the carcass below, the thing in the trees watching me with that patient, considering expression. Then it said, "You found my prints." The voice was low and deliberate, shaped carefully around the words, as if each one had been selected from a larger inventory. There was an accent I could not place, something that was not regional, but was instead the product of learning language from a distance, from overhearing rather than being taught. I did not respond immediately. My mouth had gone dry in a way that had nothing to do with thirst, and my hands were gripping my knees, and I could feel my pulse in my fingertips. "Yes," I said finally. "You didn't tell anyone." "There's no one to tell. I'm alone out here." "You have a radio in your camp," it said. "I've seen it." That particular detail, that it knew about the radio, that it had been close enough to my tent to observe something sitting in an interior pocket of my pack, settled in my chest like a stone dropped into still water. "I haven't used it," I said. The creature moved, not toward me, but slightly, a shift of weight from one foot to the other that caused a branch somewhere above it to release a small cascade of rainwater. The movement was controlled and quiet in a way that a body that size had no right to be. Why not? I thought about the honest answer to that question before I gave it. Because I didn't know what I would say. Something shifted in the creature's expression. Not quite a smile, and not quite relief, but something between the two that I had not expected, and that made it suddenly less frightening. "That's a reasonable answer," it said. It stepped forward then, fully out of the tree line and into the gray light under the overhang, and I made myself sit still while it settled itself against the rock wall 8 feet away from me with a careful, deliberate movement that I would come to recognize over the following years as its characteristic way of doing everything, with full attention, nothing wasted. We talked for 2 hours in the rain. Its name, it told me, was not a name in any language I would recognize, but it had spent enough time near human settlements to understand the human habit of naming, and had chosen something simpler for conversations like this one. It told me to call it Eli. It had been in these mountains for 31 years. It had come south from West Virginia in the early 50s, following the logging of the high ridges there, moving ahead of the roads the way water moves ahead of a dam. In those 31 years, it had never spoken to a human being. Not because it lacked the ability, but because it had watched what happened to the ones who tried. It told me about the others. Not with dramatic detail, but with the flat, careful precision of someone describing something painful from a sufficient distance. There had been 4 of them here in 1952 when Eli arrived. A female elder it called sister, 2 younger males it did not name, and a juvenile. By 1961, 3 were gone. The 2 younger males had been found by a hunting party in the winter of 1958 and shot before anyone understood what they were looking at. The juvenile had simply disappeared in the summer of 1960, gone in the way that things go in wild places without explanation or witness. "And sister?" I asked. Eli was quiet for a moment. The rain was easing slightly. "She is still here," it said finally. "Older now. She does not travel far anymore. I see her perhaps twice a year." It said this without emotion, which told me more about the weight of it than emotion would have. By the time the rain stopped and the light began to fail, I felt as though I had been awake for 3 days. My mind was working at a different speed than my body, processing and cataloging and trying to hold on to everything at once. Eli stood to leave with the same unhurried deliberateness with which it had sat down. "Will you come back here tomorrow?" I asked. It looked at me for a long moment. "That depends on whether you behave tonight." "Behave how?" "Whether you reach for the radio," it said, and walked back into the trees without another word, leaving me sitting against the rock with my cold crackers and my wrapped cameras and the absolute certainty that I was not going to sleep at all. I did not touch the radio, but when I got back to camp, I found that it had been moved 6 inches to the left of where I had left it, and the volume dial had been turned to 0. The mistake was the recorder. I had carried it with me for the entire trip without using it. A small Marantz cassette unit I had borrowed from a friend in Asheville who did audio work for a regional public radio station. I had taken it thinking I might record creek sounds, wind, rain, the ambient texture of the forest. I had not thought about it in 11 days and had forgotten it was clipped to the side pocket of my pack. On the 4th meeting with Eli, 8 days after the conversation in the rain, I made a decision that I told myself was unconscious, but that I have spent the years since examining for traces of intention, and I have never been able to say with certainty which it was. The meetings had settled into something that resembled a pattern. I would hike to the overhang in the late morning, and Eli would arrive sometime in the following 2 hours, always from a different direction, always without sound. We would talk until the light began to drop. It asked questions about human society that were precise and unsentimental, about infrastructure, about political organization, about the economic pressures driving the expansion of roads into the highlands. I answered as accurately as I could. In return, it described its life in the mountains with a specificity that made me understand, slowly and then all at once, that I was talking to something that had watched human civilization from the outside for decades and understood certain things about it that people inside it could not see. On the 4th meeting, it was describing the changes it had observed since the 60s, the increase in recreational hiking traffic, the sound of chainsaws moving higher up the ridges each year, the disappearance of certain plant species that it had relied on and that were now gone from entire valleys. There used to be a stand of old chestnuts, it said, on the ridge above the East Fork. 40, 50 trees. I knew every one of them. By 1965, they were all dead. The blight came through, and there was nothing left. That was when I understood that nothing here was permanent, that everything I depended on could be gone before I had time to prepare. I was watching its face as it said this, trying to understand the particular quality of grief in something that did not express grief the way humans do. I was so focused on its face that I did not hear the soft click from my pack pocket. The Marantz had a motion-sensitive record function that my friend had enabled as a default setting. The jostling of my pack against the rock had triggered it. The red light was the size of a match head. It was not visible unless you were looking directly at the pocket. Eli was not looking at the pocket, but I was. For approximately 4 seconds, I did nothing. I am not going to soften that. I saw the light. I understood what it meant, and I sat still for 4 seconds. That is the part of this story I have returned to most often in the years since. Those 4 seconds in which I was something I would prefer not to have been. Then voices came from down the slope. 2 men talking loudly, the particular volume of people who feel entitled to the space they move through. Hikers, probably, cutting off the main trail. They were perhaps a quarter-mile below us, but sound carries strangely in these mountains, and they sounded closer than that. Eli heard them the instant they were audible to me. Every quality of stillness in its body changed in a way I cannot fully describe. Not tension exactly, more like a sudden redirection of all available attention, the way a candle flame will orient toward a draft. It looked at me, and then it looked at my pack. The silence between that moment and the next lasted perhaps 3 seconds. When Eli spoke, its voice had dropped to something almost below hearing. How long has it been recording? There was no point in pretending I did not know what it meant. I don't know exactly. Maybe 20 minutes? The voices below were getting neither closer nor further away. They had stopped somewhere on the slope and were doing something, resting or consulting a map. Every second felt like something being spent from a limited account. Eli stood. The movement was different from its usual deliberate rise, faster, controlled by something other than patience. "Give it to me," it said. "I'll erase it, right now, while you watch. Give it to me." "Eli." I kept my voice level with an effort that I felt in my jaw. "If you take it, I lose the recorder, and I lose any chance of showing you that I made the wrong choice, and I'm fixing it. Let me fix it." The voices below shifted, became slightly louder, then faded again as the hikers moved. Eli was watching me with an expression I had not seen before, something at the exact boundary between decision and withdrawal. The expression of a creature calculating whether this particular human being was worth any more of its trust. I took the Marantz from my pack pocket. I rewound the tape to the beginning of the recorded section. I held down the record and play buttons simultaneously and let it run, erasing in real time, not looking away from Eli's face while it happened. It took 6 minutes. Neither of us spoke. Somewhere below us, the hikers' voices receded entirely, and the forest returned to its own sounds. When the tape was blank, I ejected the cassette and held it out. Eli looked at it for a long moment, then reached out and took it from my hand. Its fingers were warm, and the skin where they brushed mine was rougher than leather, and nothing like what I had imagined in those first seconds under the overhang. It broke the cassette without apparent effort, the plastic giving with a sharp, clean crack, and set the pieces on the rock between us. "You waited 4 seconds," it said. "Yes." "Why?" I did not have an answer that was not shameful. "I don't know." Eli looked at me for a long time. Then it said something I have carried in the part of myself that I do not usually examine. 4 seconds of wrong and 6 minutes of right. I have known humans who could not manage even the 6 minutes. I will come back tomorrow. It stepped away from the overhang and was gone before I could respond, leaving the broken cassette on the rock, and the weight of those 4 seconds sitting in my chest, where it would remain, in one form or another, for the next 40 years. The years that followed did not look extraordinary from the outside. I continued to work as a wildlife photographer. I published work in magazines, built a modest reputation, won a minor regional award in 1987 for a series on raptor migration in the southern Appalachians. I bought a small house on the edge of Asheville's eastern sprawl in 1989 and spent as little time in it as I could manage. People who knew me professionally described me as dedicated. People who knew me personally, and there were not many, described me as remote. What they could not see was the parallel life I had been living in the mountains every autumn since 1983. Eli and I met irregularly, never more than 4 or 5 times a year, sometimes only once. The pattern was governed entirely by Eli's assessment of safety and my ability to get back into the deep backcountry without drawing attention. After the recorder incident, I never brought any audio equipment into the field. I reduced the number of cameras I carried and stopped photographing anything within a mile of the overhang. These were not rules Eli had stated explicitly. They were the shape that trust took between us, and I maintained that shape carefully. The conversations deepened in the way that conversations do when time is not a pressure. Eli told me things about its species that I will not record fully here, not because they are not remarkable, but because they are not mine to record. What I will say is that by the mid-1980s, I understood that Eli was not alone in the mountains in the way I had initially assumed. Sister was still present, as Eli had mentioned, older and increasingly careful. There were others Eli knew of in the broader Appalachian Range, in the deep woods of western Virginia and eastern Tennessee, and the wild creek drainages along the Kentucky border. They were not a population in any meaningful biological sense. They were remnants, scattered survivors of something that had once been less precarious. The threat was not dramatic. It did not arrive as hunters or researchers or government agencies, though Eli spoke of past encounters with all three. It arrived as it always arrives in wild places, quietly, incrementally, in the form of roads. Each year, the roads pushed further into the highlands. New logging contracts, new recreation developments, new fiber optic installation routes requiring clear-cut corridors through terrain that had not been disturbed in decades. Eli mapped the encroachment for me in the language of a creature that measures geography in seasons and food sources rather than in miles. "This creek is gone," it would say, or, "The eastern ridge is too exposed now. I can no longer cross it in daylight." In 1991, Sister died. Eli told me on a cold November morning at the overhang, which we had continued to use all those years because familiarity had made it comfortable for both of us. It told me with the same measured precision it used for everything, no more or less affect than the facts required, which was how I had come to understand that in Eli's register, that particular tone was the one reserved for things that mattered most. "When?" I asked. "Early October. She went to the high ridge above the East Fork. She went there often in the last few years. She was simply there one morning, and then she was not." "I'm sorry," I said, which felt insufficient. "She was the last one I knew before they were taken," Eli said, "in 1958. She was old enough to remember when there were more of us than I have fingers." We sat without speaking for a while. The forest in November has a different quality than in other seasons. Thinner light, longer shadows, the sound of wind through bare branches rather than leaves. It feels like a season of inventory, of counting what remains. "Are there others?" I asked. "Still in the region, besides the ones you mentioned before?" Eli looked at me. "There are. Fewer than there were." "How do they survive? With the roads, the development?" "The same way they always have." Eli paused. "Some of them have adapted in ways I have not, ways I would not choose." It stopped there and did not elaborate, and I had learned enough by then to recognize when not to push. I drove home to Asheville that evening, on roads I had driven 100 times, through small towns I knew by name, past gas stations and diners and school parking lots, and all the ordinary infrastructure of lives lived at a particular scale. I kept thinking about what Eli had said, adapted in ways I have not, ways I would not choose. I thought about it the way you think about a sentence that contains more than it says, turning it over, looking at its underside. I did not arrive at any conclusion, but I began, from that evening on, to look more carefully at the people around me. Not with suspicion exactly, more with the particular attentiveness of someone who has learned that the ordinary surface of things does not always describe their interior. In 1998, Eli told me it was going to leave. We were sitting at the overhang in late September, the 15th year of our meetings, and I was 55 years old, and Eli was something I no longer tried to calculate in human terms. The light was low and amber, the way it gets in the southern highlands in September, when the haze lifts and the air has that particular clarity that feels like a gift before winter. North, it said, in answer to my question. There is still country there that is manageable. The pressures are different, slower. I know of others who have gone ahead. How long have you been considering this? Since Sister died, but there were reasons to stay. It looked at me directly. You were one of them. I did not say anything. I had reached an age where some compliments are simply too large to respond to with words. I want to tell you something before I go, Eli said. Something I have not told you before because I was not certain of it until recently. I waited. Some of us have not gone north. Some of the younger ones, the ones who came after my generation, they have made a different choice. They have moved toward the cities rather than away from them. Not into the cities, not openly, but to the edges, the margins. They have studied human behavior long enough that they can pass within a certain range of human activity without detection, as long as the conditions are right. Eli paused. I do not agree with this choice. It is too dangerous, too close, too dependent on humans failing to notice. But I understand why they made it. There is no more deep country to go to. They have run out of a way. How close? I said. Closer than you would be comfortable with, I think. I thought about the edges of Asheville, the developments that had pushed into the surrounding forest over the past 20 years. The greenways and the park borders and the creek corridors that ran through the city like stitching. Are any of them near me? I asked. Near Asheville? Eli was quiet for a moment. I think you should focus on the question of what you would do with that information if I gave it to you, it said, rather than the information itself. We sat together for the last time in the kind of silence that has weight and texture and does not require filling. When the light began to fail, Eli stood, and I stood, and we faced each other in the amber October evening in the mountains where we had been meeting for 15 years. You kept your promise, Eli said, from the beginning and through everything. It was not difficult, I said, which was mostly true. It was more difficult than you admit. It placed its hand on my shoulder for a moment, the warm, heavy pressure of it, the calloused reality of it. There is a younger one. It knows your name. I have told it that you can be trusted. Why? Because it will need someone eventually. They all do. And because you will be older and less able to travel into the deep country, and it is better for you both if the arrangement is more accessible. It paused. It will find you when it is ready. Do not look for it. I nodded. Live carefully, Daniel Cross, Eli said. The world is paying more attention than it used to. It walked into the trees, and the forest took it the way the forest always had, completely and immediately, as if it had simply stepped through a door that closed behind it. I drove back to Asheville in the dark and sat in my kitchen for a long time, drinking tea I did not taste, thinking about margins and edges, and the difference between hiding and disappearing, and about what it meant to be trusted with information you had no way of verifying and no safe way to act upon. That night, for the first time, I double-locked both doors. I am 69 years old now. My hands have the spots and stiffness of a man who spent decades in cold mountain air, and I process my photographs digitally now on a computer that sits on the same kitchen table where I have eaten 10,000 solitary meals. The work is slower than it used to be. The mountains are further away in the ways that matter. The younger one Eli mentioned came to me 4 years after Eli left. It was autumn again, a Tuesday evening in October, and I was sitting on the back porch of my house at the edge of the city with a glass of bourbon, watching the last light leave the line of trees at the far edge of the yard where the city's greenway began. I had lived in this house for years and had always appreciated that the greenway was there, that the city had, almost by accident, preserved a corridor of older tree cover running from the park system through the residential neighborhoods and down to the creek. The younger one was smaller than Eli, its coloring lighter, its face somehow less weathered by decades of mountain winter. It came out of the tree line at the yard's edge at dusk, which was not fully dark, but was the color of a bruise, and it stood at the edge of the yard and looked at me for a long time before I said anything. "Eli said you'd find me," I said, keeping my voice level with the practice of years. "Eli said you could be trusted," it said. Its English was slightly different from Eli's, more current, less formal. It had learned differently, I understood. Not from a distance, not from overhearing, but from something closer. We talked for hours on that porch, and on many porches after that, over the following years, sometimes in my yard, occasionally in the greenway itself after dark, once, memorably, in my kitchen, where it sat across from me at the table and drank water from a glass with a deliberateness that would have been absurd if it had not been, in its way, perfectly courteous. Its name I will not give here. What it told me about its life I will not give in full, because some of it describes the lives of others, and it is not mine to share. What I will say is what Eli had warned me. It lived at the margin, not in the mountains, but in the covered drainage corridors and dense buffer plantings and utility easements that run through cities like a shadow infrastructure, invisible to people who are not looking. It moved through the edges of Asheville with a care and precision that made the city legible to me in a completely different way, as a landscape of gaps and cover and sight lines, rather than of streets and destinations. It told me about others in the region, more than I had expected. Not many, but more, adapting, surviving, watching. It told me something else that I have thought about every day since. The ones before us, it said, on an evening last spring when we were sitting in the greenway in the dark, the sound of the city around us, somebody's music coming through an open window 3 houses away. They believed that hiding meant going further in, further from the roads, from the light, from the noise. But there is no further in anymore. So we learned something different. "What did you learn?" I asked. "That the best place to hide something is where people are already not looking, not in the wilderness, in the familiar." It paused. "Your kind looks at a forest and sees the possibility of something unknown. You look at your own neighborhood and see only what you know. We learn to use that. I have written this account over the past 3 months, in the evenings, at this kitchen table, with the windows dark and the greenway 100 yards from my back door. I will seal it as Vincent Holloway sealed his, with instructions that it not be opened until after my death. But unlike Vincent's account, which ends in the past, in the mountains, in the safety of distance, mine ends here. Last week, the younger one left something on my back porch. A stone, smooth and gray, the kind pulled from a creek bed, placed precisely in the center of the doormat. This is how it signals that something has changed, that there is something I should know. We have not yet spoken about what the stone means. I am waiting. 2 nights ago, I was sitting at this table at 11 in the evening when I saw something move in the greenway through the kitchen window. Not clearly, not long enough to be certain. A shape between the trees, in the dark, approximately 7 feet tall, standing still, and then not there. I told myself it was a shadow, a trick of the neighboring porch light through the branches. I am good at telling myself reasonable things. But this morning, when I walked to the end of the yard to check the gate latch the way I do every morning, I found something in the soil beside the fence post. A print, pressed deep and clear in the rain-softened earth. 14 inches from palm to fingertip. 5 digits, the thumb set wide and low. Pointing toward the house, not away from it, toward it. Whatever is coming, it is closer than the mountains now. It is at the edge of my yard, in the city where I live, and it knows where I sleep. And it left me that stone on the doormat, and I do not yet know whether it is a warning or an invitation. The stone is still on the porch. I have not moved it. I am waiting to understand what I am being asked to do next, and whether, when the moment comes, I will have the same 4 seconds and the same 6 minutes that defined everything I have been and everything I have chosen to protect. I think I will. I have spent 40 years becoming the kind of person who does. But tonight, I checked the locks twice, and when I turned off the kitchen light and the room went dark, I stood at the window for a long time, looking out at the tree line, and I was not certain whether the stillness there was the ordinary stillness of a city night, or the deliberate stillness of something that had learned how to look exactly like one. If Daniel's story stayed with you the way it has stayed with me, subscribe. Not because I ask often, but because the next account I found sealed in that same deposit box changes everything you think you understood about what Daniel was actually being protected from, and I do not want you to miss it when it comes. And if you live near a greenway, near a creek corridor, near any strip of older trees running through a city, I want to know something. Have you ever stood at your window at night and felt, without being able to say why, that the stillness outside was not quite right? Leave it in the comments. I have been collecting these for 3 years now, and the pattern of where people report it is not random. It has never been random.